afternoon. Yes, I would like to share or answer, I think, two questions that have been put to me relative in relation to the debate of this afternoon. And to tell you something about developments in the world of architecture, and I called it, it's a short word for it, accessible architecture. And I think, and the first question really is relates to designing for everybody. And obviously, that is what all good design should do. It is designing for people and for all sorts of people. Now, that is in the context of the question of how has the architectural profession changed to incorporate inclusivity in the buildings. And I think I would like to think that there has been progress, probably pretty slow, but steady. And there is a number, I think, cycles that help it, and obviously it never really stops. Sometimes perhaps it feels like it gets a bit more of a push than at other times. But after the general things, I think architects are designing for people that they're doing it well. It is not just objects. Buildings are there to be used by people. And if you exclude people, that is, I think, not the right way to start. But beyond that, there is obviously then, within the world of architecture, there is best practice and guidance. So one has to familiarize oneself with what is the best way to do things, what are current and recent developments, and that can involve just learning from other buildings, learning from literature, etc. And that never stops. And I think, obviously, with the general availability of information around the world, one can share information and experiences from an ever wider range of sources. Now, obviously, the big push has been regulation. Regulation does require to meet minimum standards, and they tend to be minimum, which are reflecting perhaps the better desirable measures, so that there is a bit of a range of measures that one can consider. But the minimum does set an important sort of benchmark for all of the building to follow. I think the issue of accessibility is not really helped by one building being very good. It is really perhaps measured about how the whole of the built environment improves. Now, obviously, buildings are there for an awful long time. 60 years is the sort of design lifespan, if you like. So, what is obviously the majority of our building stock exists of existing buildings, but as they get upgraded, potential is there to improve them. But also the regulation aspect is something that is not just a local and national level. Increasingly, we can see that internationally, countries are comparing notes. A lot of developing countries are sort of almost wholesale adopting Western European and American standards and regulations to have a good starting point and to pick up where others have gone. And they, in a way, look around for what are the best rules and regulations to push it forward. Part of the design process is obviously always consulting with users, particularly if you know them, if buildings are for any particular use, and there are the specialist advisors for very particular problems. Learning from experience is part of that. You can, obviously, from what you've done, observe and see whether what you thought was a good idea actually is a good idea and works. And that also often takes time to settle in and to get the feedback. But also the type of buildings, I think transport buildings are perhaps the first category of buildings. If you look at the new generations of airports, which we've been fortunate to get some built, but actually the world of modern airports is pretty much standardized. There seems to be an almost unwritten consensus about what an airport should contain. And that is actually spreading around the world, and obviously that establishes a network in itself. And for any network, it's the weakest links which bring the network down. And I think a lot of countries seem to want to be part of that chain, if you like, that daisy-linked chain of airports. But secondly, obviously, public buildings is where accessibility for all is critical. Not only obviously because they're funded by the general public on the whole, it is there to receive and be used effectively unknown, and therefore one has to cater for the widest possible range of visitors and users. Private buildings is much more something that one can tune and see to what extent the particular requirements are there, but most private buildings will have visitors. One would not exclude people on the doorstep. And then finally, the last page of that cycle is a sort of benchmark project. So if you think about then the next cycle of improvement, one could think about benchmark projects where one pushes the boat out and see how it works out, and perhaps if it gets quoted or considered by colleagues and users as a good step forward, then it is a way of moving the wider debate forward. And I think that is obviously getting a consensus is always quite difficult, but with buildings, until it's built, on paper it can all be beautiful. It is the practice that counts. I think I just got 2 slides on this subject. One, this first slide is the stage in case that a music center. It's got a school underneath and music rooms and halls on top. Accessibility for all was key. Circulation in buildings, how you get up or down, but on the whole we say well-designed buildings, clearly understood, with accessible, with routes, vertical and horizontal routes, which are easy to understand, is essential to create what is essentially a public forum engagement. And I think the dome of the Reichstag in Berlin is to some extent, on a political level, it brings the whole idea of the competition and of the design is actually to bring the general population on top of the parliament. They can actually look down into the chamber and climb via an easy, accessible double helix ramp to the top and get a view out over Berlin. And perhaps it is that sort of liberation, if you like, that accessibility and the design, and millions of people have gone through this, whether tourists or German citizens, to enjoy and be part of this. And that, I think, is actually part of public lives, which at the best times public buildings are part of. The next question really is then access for everybody. How can it be done? And just some issues about, in terms of design approach, in terms of trying to promote that. One is, as I already mentioned, a clarity of design. I think if a building is well designed and clearly laid out, it will be easier to use, and this counts for all its users. An intuitive use, and I think that the strength also of the iPhone and the modern technologies is that you don't need to read the manual before you can start using it. And for buildings, we want buildings that are unique, have an identity, but we don't want to search for the toilets or the lift for hours. The next point is that access and approach. This is where the regulations have pushed to get access into buildings, and the approach already from the car park to the front door and getting through the front door is already a whole series of obstacles that have to be addressed much better. I think then there is also one of meeting the regulation by the letter. The next thing is to integrate it into the building as though it was always there and is naturally part of it. Because quite often it actually can improve the quality of the building for all to see and enjoy without it being a bolted on afterthought. Issues of life safety have also pushed the way ahead. Obviously, getting people out of buildings and keeping them safe while they're in buildings is critical, and that's where regulations have set, again, minimum standards. And they tend to be, although there is smoke detectors and intelligence things, the world of fire and other emergencies are very much based on the worst case scenarios. Power fails, what will you do then? So it is, in a sense, low-tech and simple. But there have also been a whole range of technical improvements which have crept into buildings and are pretty, perhaps, unremarkable by today's standard, but they are much more widely available now than they were, and perhaps also becoming more affordable. For instance, audible interfaces in lifts, infrared and movement detectors in buildings, intelligent access control, power-assisted doors, etc. And all of that has actually reduced the numbers of barriers to getting in and around buildings. Then we also have the next thing after getting through the front door is the whole issue about internal circulation and the facilities on offer. And a lot of that has centered on wheelchair access, clearances, maneuvering space, but also contrast and partially sighted, but also young and old, so that buildings are safe and well to use. And then finally, it does get into, again, to the design. How can these finishes, even if it's contrasting colors, there is still, if you like, an aesthetic judgment to be made of how this can be integrated into buildings and the world of architecture. And I think, well, to conclude, and perhaps as a small illustration of the point just made, this is a picture of the entrance of the Walbrook, a new office building in the City of London. And this is a whole, perhaps not uncommon situation of reception, impressive reception spaces for new office buildings. But it has its power-assisted revolving doors, it has its glass doors for those who don't like going into a revolving door. It has a reception desk which steps down from high to low for those sitting, for those standing, for short and tall people. It has the integrated technology there, but also there is a human to set you on your way. And then the whole issue about lifts and vertical movement in buildings. Obviously, lifts have been around for a long time, but they're actually a fairly sophisticated piece of technology, and developments are not stopping. I think the technology is creeping into the lift controls, the amount of visual information you can get and audible information of where you're going, what's on what floor, in terms of the alarms, in terms of the handrails, in terms of the visual contrast. This lift is a fully glowing box almost, and it's sitting in a glass shaft. So the lift arrives and you just see the box almost through the shaft. So that in itself is an experience, I think, which hopefully for everybody using it is a safe but also an exciting way to go up and down buildings. Thank you.